Bleach masks a multitude of sins, but it cannot scrub away a bruise. She stood in the center of a multi-million-dollar estate, a disposable ghost holding a dust rag, trying to hide a swollen eye from a man who noticed everything. He wasn't supposed to be home today. The sponge dragged across the marble, leaving a damp, streaky trail that would evaporate in seconds. Clara leaned her weight into her palms, the cartilage in her knees grinding against the thin fabric of her uniform. The floor was cold. It was always cold in the Russo estate, a sprawling mausoleum of glass, steel, and stone tucked behind iron gates in the hills. She smelled of industrial lemon polish and stale sweat. Her jaw throbbed in time with her heartbeat, a dull, rhythmic ache that radiated up into her left temple. Mickey had worn his brass ring yesterday. He usually did when he was collecting, a subtle intimidation tactic that he liked to make physical when people didn't have the envelope of cash ready. Clara hadn't had the envelope. The rent had gone up, the heat had broken, and the math of her survival had finally tipped into the negative. Mickey hadn't cared about the math. He only cared about the backhand that sent her stumbling into the brick wall of her apartment building. Clara paused her, scrubbing, rocking back on her heels. She reached up with a wet, pruny finger and tapped the skin beneath her eye. A sharp hiss of breath escaped her teeth. The flesh was hot, swollen tight, and painted in ugly, mottled shades of violet and sickly yellow. In the staff bathroom at 5 a.m., she had slathered it in cheap drugstore concealer, layering the chalky beige paste until it looked like a patch of dry plaster clinging to her cheekbone. It felt stiff every time she blinked. She wasn't a hero in a tragedy. She was just a 26-year-old woman working 60 hours a week who had made a bad choice borrowing money from a worse man. There was no romance in poverty. It was just exhausting. Clara dipped her sponge back into the bucket. The water was turning gray. The house was completely silent, save for the low, vibrating hum of the central air conditioning and the distant, rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Dominic Russo demanded quiet. He demanded perfection. He was a man composed entirely of sharp angles and cold demands, existing in Clara's world mostly as a series of after effects. A glass smelling faintly of amber liquor left on a mahogany desk, a custom-tailored suit jacket draped carelessly over a velvet chair, the metallic scent of gun oil lingering in the air of the West Wing. She had worked here for 8 months. She had spoken to him exactly 3 times. "Miss, the coffee is burnt. Do not touch the papers on the right side of the desk. Close the door on your way out." That was the extent of their dynamic. She was part of the furniture, an appliance that cleaned the other appliances. And that was exactly how Clara wanted it. In Dominic's world, to be noticed was to be scrutinized. And to be scrutinized by a man who ran the city's underworld was a death sentence. She hauled the heavy plastic bucket up by its wire handle, the metal biting into her calloused palm. She needed to finish the hallway and move to his study. The schedule dictated that the study be dusted and vacuumed by noon. Dominic was supposed to be at the shipyards today. He never returned before 7 in the evening. Clara wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist, smudging a line of dust across her skin. She lugged her supplies down the long corridor, the rubber soles of her cheap sneakers squeaking faintly against the pristine floors. The walls were lined with art she couldn't understand, / marks of red and black on massive white canvases that probably cost more than her life insurance policy. She pushed open the heavy oak doors of the primary study. The room smelled different than the rest of the house. Leather, old paper, a faint, lingering ghost of expensive cigar smoke. It was a masculine, heavy scent that always made Clara's chest tighten instinctively. She left the bucket by the door and grabbed her microfiber cloth and the can of wood polish. She kept her head down. She didn't look at the files stacked on the desk. She didn't look at the safe built into the wall behind the bookshelf. Survival here was a game of deliberate blindness. Clara sprayed the polish. The sharp chemical scent of aerosol cut through the heavy leather smell. She began to wipe down the massive oak desk, her arm moving in tight, rhythmic circles. Tick, tick, tick. The clock in the hall echoed. Then, another sound. The heavy, mechanical clunk of the front door deadbolt retracting. Clara froze. The cloth stopped dead on the wood. The hairs on the back of her arms stood up, prickling against the polyester of her uniform. Footsteps. Hard, leather-soled shoes striking the marble foyer. Heavy, deliberate. Not the hurried, nervous scuff of the estate manager. Not the light tap of the other maids. It was him. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her stomach. She looked at the grandfather clock visible through the open double doors. It was 11:45 a.m. He wasn't supposed to be here. She scrambled backward, nearly knocking over her bottle of polish. She needed to get out. Protocol stated that staff were to vacate any room the employer occupied, unless explicitly requested. But the footsteps were already coming down the corridor. They were too close. If she walked out now, she would bump right into his chest. Clara shrank back against the towering bookshelves, pressing her spine into the spines of unread encyclopedias, clutching the yellow microfiber cloth to her chest like a shield. She ducked her head, letting the curtain of her dull brown hair fall forward to cover the left side of her face, the side with the cracked makeup, the side with the swelling. The doorway darkened. Dominic Russo walked in. He didn't look at her. He unbuttoned the jacket of his charcoal suit with one hand, his jaw locked in a rigid line of irritation. He smelled like damp asphalt and black coffee. He moved to the small bar cart in the corner of the room, entirely ignoring the maid pressed into the shadows. Ice clinked loudly against crystal. The sound of Scotch pouring filled the tense silence. Clara held her breath. "Just leave," she prayed silently. "Grab the drink and go to the living room." Dominic took a slow sip, his throat working. He set the glass down with a heavy thud. He sighed, rolling his shoulders, and finally turned toward his desk. His eyes stopped on her bucket by the door. Then they traveled up the wall, finding her huddled against the books. "You missed a spot," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated in the floorboards. Clara swallowed hard, her throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. "Apologies, Mr. Russo. I'm leaving now." She kept her chin glued to her chest, her hair securely veiling her face. She sidestepped along the bookshelf, moving toward the door like a crab avoiding a boot. Dominic didn't move. He stood between her and the exit, leaning a hip against the edge of his massive desk, his Scotch glass held loosely in his right hand. He was a large man, not just tall, but broad, taking up too much oxygen in the room. His dark hair was slightly unkempt, a stark contrast to his usually meticulous appearance. "I didn't tell you to leave." The words weren't a shout. They were flat, factual, but they halted her instantly. Her sneakers squeaked as she stopped. "I was told to clear the room when you returned, sir," she murmured to the floorboards. Dominic took another sip of his drink. The ice rattled. "Look at me when you speak." A spike of adrenaline pierced her chest. She gripped the dust cloth so tightly her knuckles turned white. If she looked up, he would see. If he saw, he would ask. And if she lied, he would know. "You didn't lie to men like Dominic Russo. They smelled deception like copper in the air." Clara started, her voice betraying a pathetic tremble she despised. "I have bleach on my hands, sir. I need to wash them." It was a terrible excuse. "Look at me." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The casualness was gone, replaced by the steel edge of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. Clara slowly lifted her head. She tried to keep her face angled away, presenting only her right profile, but it was awkward and unnatural. Dominic frowned, a slight creasing of his forehead. He set his glass down on the desk. He took a step toward her. Clara instinctively flinched, taking a half step back until her shoulders hit the hard wood of the shelves. He stopped. His dark eyes narrowed, sweeping over her rigid posture, her trembling hands, and finally, the bizarre angle of her head. "What is wrong with your neck?" he asked, his tone shifting from authoritative to annoyed. "Nothing. I slept wrong. Turn around." "Mr. Russo, please, I have to finish the south wing." Turn your face to me, Clara. Hearing her name in his mouth felt like a shock of static electricity. He knew her name. He had never used it before. Knowing she had no choice, Clara slowly, agonizingly turned her head. The pale morning light filtering through the heavy drapes hit her face directly. The cheap concealer had cracked into a spider web of beige lines over the grotesque swelling of her cheek and eye. The bruising had spread overnight, leaking down toward her jawline in a muddy puddle of purple and black. Dominic stopped breathing. It was a microscopic pause, a brief suspension of animation, but Clara caught it. The annoyance drained from his features, leaving behind a cold, blank slate that was infinitely more terrifying. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, preparing for, she didn't know what. Reprimand? Disgust? Being fired for bringing unsightly drama into his pristine house? Instead, she felt the sudden, shocking heat of his fingers. He didn't grab her. He merely brushed the pad of his thumb against her cheekbone, just below the worst of the swelling. His hands were large, heavy, and calloused from things she didn't want to think about. Yet his touch was startlingly light. Clara gasped at the contact, her eyes flying open. She looked up into his face. He was staring at the bruise with the intense, clinical focus of a surgeon examining a tumor. He rubbed his thumb and forefinger together, looking at the beige paste that had come off on his skin. "Dollar store makeup," he muttered, his voice dangerously soft. "You tried to plaster over a bone contusion." I fell," she blurted out. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. Dominic slowly raised his eyes from her cheek to meet hers. His gaze was entirely devoid of sympathy. It was analytical, piercing, and terrifyingly calm. "You fell." "Yes." "Onto a doorknob?" he asked, his voice flat. "Yes. I tripped in my apartment." Dominic dropped his hand. He took a half step back, creating a sliver of breathing room. A doorknob strikes a localized area. It creates a circular impact point. This, he gestured vaguely toward her face without touching her again, has a horizontal spread. Furthermore, the skin is broken in a jagged half moon right on the orbital bone. A ring did that. Clara's throat constricted. She stared at him, paralyzed. "You were struck by a right-handed man. He caught you with the back of his hand, likely wearing a heavy signet or brass ring on his middle or ring finger." Dominic tilted his head slightly. "So, I will ask you again, Clara, and I strongly suggest you do not insult my intelligence a second time." He leaned in, the scent of espresso and wool enveloping her. "Who hurt you?" The silence in the study grew suffocating. Clara felt the desperate urge to laugh, a hysterical, bubbling panic rising in her chest. "Who hurt you?" It sounded like a line from a soap opera, but standing in front of Dominic Russo, it felt like an interrogation in a concrete basement. She wasn't a damsel waiting for a mob boss to avenge her. She was a woman who needed her paycheck. If she dragged his name into her mess, if she admitted a petty street thug was extorting her, Dominic might just fire her to keep the filth away from his doorstep. "It's a personal matter," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked down at his handmade Italian shoes. "It won't affect my work. I can clean the floors just fine with one eye." "I did not ask if it would affect your work." "Then why do you care?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. It was a reckless question. She braced herself for an explosion. Dominic stared down at her. The muscle in his jaw ticked. He didn't yell, he didn't sneer. "Because you are in my house," he stated quietly. "You eat my food in the kitchen. You touch my possessions. You are under my roof." He stepped closer, crowding her against the books again. "And someone outside this house put their hands on something that belongs under my roof. That is a transgression I do not tolerate." Something that belongs under my roof. Not someone, something. The phrasing was cold, territorial, and completely devoid of romantic affection. It was about possession. It was about order. He was a man who controlled his environment with a psychotic grip, and Clara's bruised face was an unauthorized variable. Yet, beneath her fear, An ugly, treacherous sliver of relief pierced her heart. Someone noticed. For the first time in years, someone was looking at her damage and refusing to look away. "His name is Mickey," she whispered, the fight draining out of her all at once. Her shoulders slumped. "Mickey Wallace. He runs a loan operation out of the back of a pawn shop on 5th and Elm." Dominic didn't react to the name. He just cataloged it. "How much do you owe him?" "4,000. It was 2, but the interest. He compounds it weekly." Clara closed her eyes, the shame burning hotter than the bruise. "I missed a payment. And he hit you for it." He said it was a warning, a late fee. Dominic absorbed this information in total silence. The grandfather clock ticked loudly in the distance. Without another word, he turned his back on her. He walked around to his heavy desk and pulled out a leather-bound chair. "Sit." Clara blinked. "Sir, my bucket." "Sit down, Clara." She hurried forward and sat on the edge of the leather chair, her knees pressed tightly together, her hands gripping her thighs. She felt absurd. Her uniform was stained with bleach spots. Her hair was a mess, and she was sitting in a chair that cost more than her car. Dominic walked out of the study. Clara sat there in the quiet, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had done it. She had spoken the name. What was he doing? Was he calling the police? No, men like Dominic didn't call the police. Was he calling the estate manager to draft her final paycheck? 5 minutes passed. The ice in Dominic's abandoned Scotch glass melted, slipping down with a soft clink. Footsteps returned. Dominic walked back into the room. In his right hand, he held a thick linen hand towel, the kind kept in the guest bathrooms, wrapped tightly around a block of ice from the kitchen. In his left hand, his cell phone. He stopped next to her chair and handed her the ice pack. "Hold this to your face," he ordered. Clara took it, her fingers brushing his. The cold immediately numbed the throbbing in her cheek. She pressed the linen to her swollen eye, wincing as the pressure hit the bone. Dominic stood beside her, leaning his hips against the edge of the desk. He dialed a number on his phone, put it to his ear, and looked down at her. "Silvio," Dominic said into the phone. His voice was casual, almost bored. "There is a pawn shop on 5th and Elm. A man named Mickey Wallace runs paper out of the back." Clara's breath hitched. She lowered the ice pack slightly. "No," Dominic continued, his eyes locked on Clara's bruised face. "I don't want his operation. I want him." A pause as the man on the other end spoke. "Alive," Dominic corrected softly. "But bring him to the warehouse on the docks. And Silvio, make sure he's wearing his rings." Dominic hung up the phone. He slid it into his trouser pocket and looked down at the maid sitting rigidly in his chair. Clara was trembling. The reality of what she had just set in motion crashed over her. This wasn't a movie. This was blood. This was violence. And it was happening because of her. "You didn't have to do that," she breathed, her voice shaking violently. "I could have paid him, eventually." Dominic leaned down, placing a hand on the armrest of her chair, boxing her in. The scent of cold espresso and danger was suffocating. "He touched what is mine to protect," Dominic said, his voice a low rumble. "You don't owe him anything anymore, Clara. By tonight, Mickey Wallace won't be able to collect a debt from a dead dog." He reached out, his thumb gently pushing the ice pack firmer against her cheek. "Keep the ice on. You have a mess in the hallway to clean up when you're done." He stood up, adjusted his cuffs, and walked back out of the room, leaving Clara sitting in the freezing, terrifying silence of his protection. The ice melted long before her shift ended, leaving a damp patch on the thigh of her uniform where the linen towel rested. Clara didn't stop working. She couldn't. If she stopped moving her hands, her brain would catch up to the reality of the morning, and she was terrified that if she started screaming, she wouldn't be able to stop. She scrubbed the baseboards in the south corridor until her fingernails chipped. She vacuumed the Persian rugs in the formal dining room, the aggressive mechanical roar of the machine drowning out the panicked ticking in her own head. Alive, but bring him to the warehouse on the docks. She knew what happened at the docks. Everyone in the city knew, even if they pretended they didn't. It was where the rules of civil society ended and the brutal mathematics of Dominic Russo's world began. Mickey was a brute. He had knocked a tooth loose from an old man in Clara's building last month over a $50 dispute. Mickey deserved to be stopped. But did he deserve the warehouse? Clara emptied the vacuum canister into the trash, a cloud of fine gray dust blooming in the air. She inhaled it, coughing violently, the spasm rattling her bruised face and bringing tears to her eyes. She wiped them away with a dirty wrist. She wasn't a saint. She didn't have the luxury of absolute morality. Morality was for people who didn't have to choose between buying groceries and paying for heating. If Mickey died, her debt died with him. It was a cold, ugly, selfish calculation, and it sat heavy in her stomach like swallowing a stone. By 9 p.m., the estate was a tomb. The day staff had gone home. Clara was on the evening rotation, tasked with polishing the silver in the expansive, industrial-grade kitchen and ensuring the ground floor was entirely reset for the morning. The kitchen was blindingly bright, lit by harsh, recessed LED lights that bounced off the stainless steel counters. The smell of copper polish stung her nostrils, sharp and chemical. She sat on a stool at the island, methodically rubbing a dark paste into a heavy silver serving spoon, her thumb working in relentless circles. Clack. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the silent house. It wasn't the heavy deadbolt, just the heavy oak shutting. Clara froze, the silver spoon slipping slightly in her grip. Heavy footsteps moved through the foyer, slow, dragging slightly. They didn't head toward the grand staircase. They were moving down the hall, toward the kitchen. Panic, icy and sharp, spiked the back of her neck. She slid off the stool, standing rigidly behind the island, the polishing cloth clutched in one hand and the heavy spoon in the other, a pathetic, improvised weapon. The swinging door pushed open. Dominic stepped into the stark white light. Clara stopped breathing. He looked entirely different from the immaculate, untouchable figure he had been that morning. His suit jacket was gone. His silk tie had been discarded, the top 3 buttons of his crisp white shirt undone, exposing the dark hair on his chest and a gold chain that caught the harsh light. His sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and dusted with dark hair. He looked exhausted. The skin around his eyes was tight, drawn with a fatigue that went deeper than a lack of sleep. It was the weariness of a man who had just spent hours submerged in something dark and heavy. And then the smell hit her. It rolled off him in a wave, overpowering the sharp scent of the copper polish. It was the smell of the ocean's salt water and rotting kelp mixed with the unmistakable, metallic tang of iron. It smelled like wet pennies and adrenaline. It smelled like blood. Dominic stopped just inside the doorway. He didn't look at her immediately. He looked at the massive double-door refrigerator. He walked toward it, his heavy shoes scuffing slightly on the tile. As he passed her, Clara saw it. A dark, rusty smear, no larger than a thumbprint, stamped into the pristine white cotton of his cuff. He opened the refrigerator, the cold air rolling out in a pale mist. He reached past the imported mineral waters and grabbed a generic plastic bottle of club soda. He twisted the cap off with one hand, his knuckles stark white against the plastic, and drank half the bottle in 3 long, desperate swallows. Clara stood frozen, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was a rabbit sharing a cage with a wolf that had just returned from a hunt. He lowered the bottle. He wiped the back of his hand across his mouth. Slowly, he turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were hollow, stripped of the calculating sharpness from the study. They were just dark, flat, and impossibly empty. He looked at the spoon in her hand, then up to her bruised face. "Put the silver away, Clara," he said. His voice was a rasp, stripped of its usual smooth resonance. "It's late." She swallowed hard. Her throat felt full of sand. "I'm almost finished, sir." I said, "Put it away." It wasn't a yell, but the command carried a vibrating density that made her spine snap straight. She dropped the spoon onto the counter. It clattered loudly in the quiet room. Dominic leaned back against the closed refrigerator door, letting his head drop back against the stainless steel with a soft thud. He closed his eyes. The silence stretched, pulling taut like a wire about to snap. Clara knew she should leave. She should excuse herself, walk to her tiny quarters behind the laundry room, lock the door, and pretend none of this had happened. Instead, a strange, morbid curiosity rooted her to the floor. She looked at his hands. They were violently red, raw as if they had been scrubbed with a wire brush. "Is it?" Clara started, her voice betraying a pathetic tremble. She hated herself for asking, but the words clawed their way up her throat. "Is it done?" Dominic didn't open his eyes. He stayed leaning against the metal, breathing in a slow, measured rhythm. Mickey Wallace had a very lucrative side business, Dominic murmured, his voice sounding like gravel grinding under a tire. He was holding collateral from young women, passports, photographs, leverage to keep them compliant when the compound interest became impossible to pay. Clara felt a sickening lurch in her stomach. Mickey had never asked her for photos, but he had taken the title to her rusted-out Honda Civic, effectively trapping her in a 3-mile radius of her apartment. "He was a parasite," Dominic continued softly. He finally opened his eyes, tilting his head forward to look at her. The overhead light caught the dark smudge on his cuff again. "He no longer has a side business. He no longer has a pawn shop." Dominic took a slow breath, his chest rising and falling heavily, and he no longer has his right hand. The kitchen seemed to tilt on its axis. Clara gripped the edge of the marble island, her knuckles turning white. A wave of profound nausea washed over her, followed immediately by an electric, terrifying surge of relief. Mickey was gone. The brass ring that had cracked her face open would never touch another human being. She stared at Dominic. He wasn't looking for absolution. He wasn't boasting. He was simply reporting a finalized transaction. He had violently restructured the world to excise a tumor, and he had done it because the tumor had bumped into his property. "Are you hungry?" The question fell from her lips before her brain could authorize it. It was absurd. It was domestic and ridiculous, and entirely out of place in the blood-soaked reality of the conversation. Dominic blinked, a flash of genuine confusion breaking through his grim facade. "What? Are you hungry?" Clara repeated, her voice steadying. She stepped away from the polishing supplies. She moved toward the massive industrial stove. "You look like you're going to pass out, mister." "Russo, when was the last time you ate?" Dominic stared at her as if she had suddenly started speaking a dead language. He looked from her bruised face to the stove and back again. "I don't need you to cook for me." "I know you don't need me to," Clara said, turning on the gas burner. A ring of blue flame hissed into existence. "But you're going to sit at that island, and I'm going to make you a grilled cheese sandwich, because you just saved my life, and making a sandwich is the only currency I have right now." It was the most she had ever spoken to him. It was bordering on insubordination. Dominic didn't move for a long moment. He just watched her pull a loaf of sourdough from the pantry and retrieve a block of sharp cheddar from the refrigerator he was leaning against. He had to step aside to let her reach the butter. Slowly, deliberately, he walked to the island. He pulled out one of the high metal stools and sat down. He placed his raw, red hands flat on the cool marble surface. He watched her cook. He watched the way she meticulously buttered the bread, the way she kept her head slightly turned to hide the worst of the yellowing bruise. He didn't speak. The smell of melting butter and toasting bread filled the kitchen, slowly overpowering the scent of brine and copper. The hiss of the pan replaced the ticking of the clock. Clara slid the sandwich onto a ceramic plate, sliced it perfectly down the diagonal, and placed it on the counter in front of him. She pushed a paper napkin toward his elbow. Dominic looked at the sandwich. Then he picked up a half and took a bite. The crunch was loud in the quiet room. He ate the entire thing in less than 3 minutes, methodical and starving. Clara stood on the opposite side of the island, wiping down the counters, letting him eat in peace. When he finished, he wiped his mouth with the napkin. He stood up, the legs of the stool scraping against the floor. "Your debt is clear, Clara. he said quietly, walking toward the hallway door. He paused on the threshold, looking back over his shoulder. Don't fall on any more doorknobs. Then he was gone, leaving Clara alone in the bright kitchen, the smell of burnt butter mingling with the ghost of violence in the air. 5 days later, the violent swelling on Clara's face had deflated into a sickly, yellow-green map tracking along her cheekbone. She didn't need the chalky drugstore concealer anymore. The pain had settled into a dull, manageable ache whenever she chewed. The estate had returned to its sterile, immaculate hum, but the oxygen around her felt entirely different. The estate manager, Harrison, no longer barked at her to move her cart out of the corridors. He quietly stepped aside. The other maids fell dead silent the second she entered the laundry room, their eyes darting from her fading bruise down to the linoleum floor. She hated it. She wasn't a queen holding court. She was just the woman the boss had noticed in Dominic Russo's ecosystem that made her radioactive. On Friday afternoon, she was pushing her cleaning cart past the primary study when a voice cut through the quiet. Clara. The cart's rubber wheels squeaked as she stopped. She turned and pushed the heavy oak doors wider, stepping into the dense, masculine air of old paper, leather, and faint cigar smoke. Dominic sat behind the massive mahogany desk. He looked immaculate again, a sharp navy suit, silk tie pulled tight, the feral, bloody exhaustion of Monday night completely erased. He didn't greet her. He simply reached into his top drawer, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and tossed it onto the leather blotter. It landed with a dull, heavy smack. Open it. Clara's sneakers squeaked against the polished hardwood as she closed the distance. Her fingers were stiff as she undid the metal clasp and tipped the envelope upside down. 2 things slid out. The first was a piece of cheap, ruled notebook paper. It was her original loan agreement with Mickey Wallace, her desperate signature sitting at the bottom. The paper was torn cleanly diagonally down the middle. The second item was a heavy piece of brass. It was Mickey's signet ring. The metal was deeply gouged, one side of the band flattened entirely, as if it had been crushed in a mechanic's vise. Caught deep in the crevices of the engraved bulldog's face was a flaky, dark brown crust. It smelled faintly of copper and rust. Clara stopped breathing. The room suddenly felt suffocatingly hot. She remembered the blinding white flash of pain when that ring had fractured her skin. Now it was just a piece of broken scrap on a rich man's desk. The paper is yours to burn, Dominic said smoothly, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. The ring is a reminder. Clara stared at the dried blood. Of what? That the outside world is chaotic, he replied, his voice a low, steady vibration. And that you are no longer subject to it. You work for me. You belong to this house. Nothing touches what belongs to this house without my explicit permission. Do you understand? It wasn't a romantic confession. It was a territorial claim. It was a cold iron fence being built around her life. Clara looked at the crushed brass, then up at the man who had worn its owner's blood on his cuff. He was a monster. He orchestrated violence from a leather chair. But as she stood in the absolute safety of his study, the exhausting mathematics of poverty finally silenced in her head, she realized a cynical truth. A monster was only a nightmare if it wasn't your monster. Clara picked up the torn paper. Her hand didn't shake. She left the bloody ring sitting on the mahogany wood. I understand, Mr. Russo. Good. He picked up a silver pen, dismissing her entirely. The second-floor library windows are smudged. See to them before you leave. Right away, sir. Clara walked out, her grip steady on her cart, leaving the brutality of the world locked safely behind his doors. The line between protector and predator is razor thin, and Clara just learned how heavy the cost of safety truly is. Did she make the right choice staying in the monster's den, or is she just trading one cage for another? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story hooked you, hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a dark, gritty romance, and subscribe for more intense audio stories. See you next time.